Lab 16 Cardiology's got to be one of my favorite chapters. The heart is centered in the thoracic cavity, but its longitudinal axis is angled slightly to the left. The broader superior aspect of the heart, right superficial to the atria, is the base of the heart, and then the tip of the heart is the apex of the heart. The heart has four surfaces. The anterior surface is termed the sternocostal surface of the heart because it's right up against the sternum and the ribs, so sternocostal surface of the heart. And then it has, on the posterior-inferior aspect, a diaphragmatic surface of the heart where it butts up against the diaphragm. And then the two left and right surfaces are named a little differently. The left surface of the heart is the pulmonary surface of the heart, and the right surface is termed the right border of the heart. The anterior interventricular groove separates the right and left ventricles, and it's this subtle fat and vessel-filled depression on the sternocostal surface of the heart. If we turn it around to the diaphragmatic surface of the heart, we find the posterior interventricular groove. The coronary groove separates the atria from the ventricles and is this fat depression that goes all the way around the heart. The heart has three layers. The outermost is termed epicardium, which is a serous membrane that makes up the innermost portion of the pericardium. Then you have the middle layer, which is myocardium, which is composed mainly of cardiac muscle tissue. And then on the inner surface, the most deep layer would be endocardium, which makes up this inner surface of the ventricles and the atrium. Superiorly, the first two chambers are atria. You have the left atrium and the right atrium, and in between the atrium you have an interatrial septum, which is just separating the two atria. You also have an interventricular septum, which separates the two ventricles. So this portion right here that makes up this border, or this wall, is the interventricular septum. The right atrium of the heart receives blood from the top part of the body through the superior vena cava, and the lower portion of the body from the inferior vena cava. And the portion of the atrium which receives this blood is termed the vena caval sinus, which is just this hollow opening. Attached to the right atrium is a blind-ended portion that is termed the right auricle of the heart. And anatomists saw these projections on the heart and they thought they looked like ears, and so they named them auricles of the heart. The superior vena cava opens into the right atrium at the opening of the superior vena cava, and then likewise the inferior vena cava, which is not shown completely right here, but the opening is just termed the opening of the inferior vena cava. Adjacent to the opening of the inferior cava is this little portion right here. This little landmark is termed the opening of the coronary sinus, and this is the terminal portion of the great cardiac vein that returns blood to the heart itself. Number 24 is scar tissue termed fossa ovalis of the heart. It's a subtle indentation of the interatrial septum, and it marks the position of the fetal foramen ovale that then scars over to become this fossa ovalis of the heart. Also poorly illustrated on this model are muscles inside both the left and the right atria, termed pectinate muscles, and they're just ridges formed by fasciculi of atrial myocardium that are located on the inner surfaces of these two atria. Moving down, the first ventricle is the right ventricle of the heart, and this receives blood from the right atrium, and then it pumps the blood into the pulmonary trunk here. This first valve is the right atrioventricular valve, or tricuspid valve. And while it's not illustrated very well, there's an anterior, a posterior, and septal cusps. These finger-like projections coming off of it are termed chordae tendineae, and they're what attach to the margins of the leaflets of the right and left atrioventricular valves, and they anchor them to what's called papillary muscles. The papillary muscles are a little bit better illustrated on the right or the left ventricle. I think that's what they're trying to show here. Lining the walls of the left and the right ventricles are trabeculae carnae, which is just muscular bundles. Trabeculae carnae. In the right ventricle, and it's not illustrated on this model either, but there's a fasciculus of cardiac muscle tissue that extends from the interventricular septum right here to the wall of the right ventricle. So there's a little muscular piece that acts like a bridge right down here from the interventricular septum to the wall of the right ventricle, termed the trabecula septomarginalis. As blood is pumped from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, this hollow portion superior to the right ventricle is termed the Conus Arteriosus, or infundibulum of the heart, and it just basically leads to the opening of this pulmonary trunk. And then this is the pulmonary valve. The pulmonary valve, or valve of the pulmonary trunk, has a left, right, and anterior semilunar valvulae. So valvulae is plural. This would be our anterior semilunar valvula, left semilunar valvula, and right semilunar valvula. The left atrium of the heart receives blood back from the lungs after they've been oxygenated, or after the blood has been oxygenated. It has 4 pulmonary veins coming into it, and as a result you have 4 openings of pulmonary veins. The left ventricle is what receives blood from the left atrium, and it pumps blood to the rest of the body. So it has a thicker myocardium, and it has a greater contractile force so that it can pump blood systemically. The left atrioventricular valve is also called the mitral valve, and while poorly illustrated with these valves, it has an anterior and posterior cusp, as well as smaller commissural cusps on the outside. Because it has only 2 major cusps, the left atrioventricular valve is also known as the bicuspid valve. As blood is pumped from the left ventricle up into the aorta, it passes through the aortic valve. The aortic valve has a right, a left, and posterior semilunar valvula. As it pumps blood up into the aorta, this is the aortic arch.